Hi, I'm Oliver, and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. It's been ages since I've done one of these, so here we are. My 5 albums to get you into grime. Grime is a genre that I've been looking forward to talking about ever since I started the channel last year, partly because it's such a fascinating genre to discuss, but also partly because I kind of experienced the rise of the genre, even if that was peripherally. Although I grew up about 80 miles away from London, the influence of grime artists like JME, Skepta, Wiley, Devlin, Kano was very clear. Those artists, their songs were the ones being traded in school playgrounds, being shared secretly on school networks, blaring out of phone speakers in tutorial lessons. It's a genre that organically grew out of the UK garage scene by artists, MCs and producers that were insistent on having their voices heard. Much of the rise of grime was due to pirate radio stations. They were such a large part of that. So places like East London, North London, Tottenham, Bow, places like that, you would have stations like Rinse FM, Heat FM, Deja Vu FM, and they housed these talents. They would get together and they'd have this room full of talented MCs that would trade bars together, and that was really how the scene grew. Not only that, but videos and DVDs such as Risky Roads and Lord of the Mics, they were being produced in a way that basically said fuck you to the brick wall that was the music industry that had no interest in hearing these artists at the beginning. It was a way of bypassing that and saying we're going to get our voices heard regardless of what you say. In that way, grime is arguably the punk of this generation. Much of the music captured a vibrant culture that was all centred around London and its suburbs, but eventually it moved out to northern cities in the UK like Birmingham, and now there's a very vibrant grime scene in Birmingham, and then also there's other smaller scenes growing in places like Blackpool as well, and Liverpool and Manchester. So grime is really growing out and becoming a much larger scene than it initially was back in the turn of the millennium. The most exciting thing is that it is and was largely an artist-led scene. You know, grime did not rise to its success because of PR marketing firms and large record labels. It was due to a collaborative effort, these massive collectives in grime, sharing tracks and collaborating on each other's songs, and sharing that, doing the pirated radio stations, the DVDs, doing shows all the time. Those were the things that made grime what they were now, and really that's such a liberating thing if you think about it, that a scene has managed to grow despite being suppressed by mainstream radio and mainstream music companies and organisations, and it's succeeded through kind of talent, bravado and belief. Although, having said that, I think there's much to be said about the watering down of grime in 2017. You know, some of the artists that are right now at the peak of their mainstream appeal is due to the fact that they're creating crossover music that's far more hip-hop mainstream influence than it is grime, but that's probably a conversation for another time. Musically, grime is a melting pot of sonic ideas, merging jungle, garage, hip-hop and dancehall influences. You'll notice the standard understood grime sound is breakbeats, syncopated rhythms, sitting around about 140 beats per minute. That is what makes this genre such a recognisable genre sonically. Yet there's so much more diversity in grime than you might initially think, and hopefully the records I've picked today will show you the diversity that I'm talking about without going too close to the really heavy crossover records that might not be considered grime. Let's do it. Number 1, Wiley, Treddin on Thin Ice, released in 2004. I'm starting with the godfather of grime, and that's a title that Wiley himself is very comfortable with. Just see his 2017 brilliant record, Godfather, that I reviewed back in January. Wiley, real name Richard Cowie, is a producer and grime artist who grew up in Bow in East London. Back at the beginning of the noughties, Wiley was part of the UK garage collective Pay As You Go Cartel before founding Roll Deep Crew, which is a very influential grime crew, and it brought together artists like Dizzee, Rascal, Tinchy Strider, Skepta, J2K. Although it must be said that those artists, there was quite a revolving door with Roll Deep Crew, so that not all of those artists were in the crew at the same time, but nevertheless they were part of that collective at some point. First off, I have to mention Wiley's undeniable effect on this new UK garage sound that was coming out of London at the turn of the millennium. One of Wiley's nicknames was Esky Boy due to the Esky beat, the self-named Esky beat that he created. Now this beat is such a core part of the grime sound. It's had such a big influence on producers and MCs. It has this bouncy, dark, soiled aesthetic that it's hard to describe it, you need to listen to it, but this is the aesthetic that he put into his album, Treddin on Thin Ice. The 15 tracks on this record are crucial to the development of grime, although there are albums that came before it, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but this set it set a precedent for all aspiring MCs and producers to try and reach. Sonically, the tracks here are a wonderful mix of that esky beat synth bounce, cutting drum samples, and often angular string samples that add a real dramatic weight to the music. This converging of styles creates the dark tone of grime, something that sounds futuristic and apocalyptic almost in a way, but it also has this dark streak of humour to it. Third track, What Do You Call It, was an early eschewing of the grime label featuring Breeze, Ryko and J2K, and they're trading these explosive flows discussing, what exactly this new type of music should be called. Should it be called two-step? Should it be called garage? And all the time you have this really infectious sample beat with these spiraling synths. It's a really great track. Elsewhere, tracks like Special Girl reveal Wiley's ability to Frankenstein tracks as a producer. It uses like a cut-up R&B vocal fragmentation, creates this soul atmosphere, but it's like a cut-up 90s R&B track that's been repurposed for the present, and it still retains the same sonic aesthetic as the rest of the album. It sounds like a grime track, basically. Closing track, I Was Lost, reveals Wiley's experimentalism as a producer. He uses ethereal synths and very abrasive samples that don't ever overshadow his own flow. It's a really great track. It has a darkness to it without ever losing that British flavour. If you really want to get into grime, start here. Number 2, Dizzee Rascal, Boy in the Corner, released in 2003. This was the beginning of grime reaching the mainstream and getting attention from the wider music press for the first time. Boy in the Corner won the Mercury Music Prize in 2003, a very important moment for the scene itself, but also the way that people perceived the scene that were standing outside of it. This was a real moment where people stood up and took notice finally. There's a reason that 14 years on, Boy in the Corner is still hailed as a cornerstone of grime. It's an authentic, perceptive, angry testament of British urban life that never becomes dour despite its social focus. Oh, and did I mention Dizzee, real name Dylan Mills, was only 18 years old at this point. 18 frickin' years old. Despite this being a debut from someone who only just reached adulthood, the lyricism, the flow, and the production on this album are fiercely original, and while it does sound like grime, it sounds very different from his MC peers. The tracks on Boy in the Corner are actually a lot slower and more varied instrumentation-wise than some of the early grime records that were coming out at the time. So you have like that palm-muted guitar joining gospel vocals on the legendary track Just a Rascal, or on Cut 'Em Off you have those glitchy, pulsing electronics that are creeping along really sinisterly. The masterful Fix Up Look Sharp, which has the balls to include nothing instrumentally other than a drum beat, vocal samples, and Dizzee's flow, and somehow it manages to be an infectious track that's so memorable, and that's a real testament to his producing powers and also his powers as an MC. And that's a track that everyone's heard of, that hit the charts back in 2003. These brave production approaches serve as a great counterpart to Dizzee's lyricism, which is inventive, dark, and unapologetic. Dizzee waxes about the trappings of life for young black men living in London and boroughs of London and cities around the country, and that's touching on his experiences of gang violence, gang culture, segregation within society, class divides. Track I Love You is a great example of the weight that the lyricism on this record has. Dizzee spits in his recognizable flow about an underage girl getting pregnant whilst juiced up, and there's detailing of these girls that are getting batteried, which is slang for being gangbanged, basically. It's difficult and uncensored lyrically, and what makes it hit even harder is the aggressive production, the fizzing bass synths, and the slicing claps. If you want a stellar example of experimental production sounds, look at this track, I Love You. This is a track for fans of Death Grips who love that abrasion and experimentalism. This is a track that was made almost over half a decade prior, so you need to listen to this. An incredibly unsettling yet unmistakably brilliant record. This stands definitely as a cornerstone of the genre of grime, but also just stands up independently as a fantastic record. Number 3, Ghetts with Freedom of Speech, released in 2008. Yeah, it's technically a mixtape, but it's the length of an album, so whatever, I'm including it. I've picked Freedom of Speech because it's a stellar example of flow being a core part of the grime sound, and Ghetts' flow is unmistakable with its venomous spitting and its palpable fury. Justin Clark, who was known as Ghetto, then changed it to Ghetts, grew up in East London. He had a hard time as a child. He was part of that perpetual cycle of violence. He was involved in knife fights, and he was involved in car crime. He went to prison, and when he came out at 18, he decided to put his anger into grime, which he will admit himself is the thing that really changed his life and turned it around. This is what I love about this record. It so explicitly roadmaps his unstoppable force and confidence through the barraging tracks on display here. You'll probably be exhausted by the end of it. Mountain is this strange four-to-the-floor track with climbing arpeggio synths, and I think it would sound a little bit twee if not for Ghetts' abrasive vocals that just hold everything together with precision. His flow on Dark Side Freestyle is completely unrelenting. It's a non-stop battering of complex rhythmic gymnastics that just build and build alongside those paranoid synths and dramatic string samples. It's such a good song. I was going to read out a section, but to be honest, it's just going to be embarrassing for everybody, including me, because it's all about the flow, and I'm not going to try and recreate it. I'm just not going to go there. Production-wise, Ghetts' vocals sit very forward in the mix, and I think that does the record a real service, because it reminds me of the components of grime culture, like the pirate radio stations and the live improv flows, the DVDs with people trading bars and kind of competing. That's the feeling you get from this, and it makes the record feel so much more organic and authentic. A great example of music that harnesses anger in a way that you just need to listen to yourself. Number 4, Kano. Home Sweet Home, released in 2005. Another key artist in the development of grime, Kano, real name Kane Robinson, grew up in East Ham in London and released his debut album Home Sweet Home in 2005. This is so different from the Ghetts record I just spoke about, and I'm hoping that this contrast proves the variance of sounds and ideas within grime as a genre. So many people think that all grime sounds exactly the same, and hopefully if you listen to these albums I'm talking about today, it will prove to you that that is far from the truth. Kano's flow doesn't have the same jagged slice that Ghetts has. It's more rounded. I would use the word soft, but I feel like that would diminish his own unique style. It's just not quite as abrasive. What Kano's lyrical style does is it switches up the straight up aggression for personality. So he's able to hold back in certain places and create a more varied approach to different tracks and different songs, and what that does is that just makes his flow all the more captivating and engaging. Home Sweet Home is a wide-ranging and considered record with diverse production styles that really complement his own sort of thoughtfully autobiographical lyricism. I think this was probably the first grime record that I actually listened to as a boy, and Kano really made a name for himself so early on with the tracks he was releasing. You know, on this album, P's and Q's is on there, which was actually an earlier single release, and that was huge when I was younger. Everyone was listening to P's and Q's, and it's a great track because it really shows off his dexterous flow and also just his ability to produce an absolute banger of a track. Reloaded is a fantastic track produced by Diplo, and it's a hybrid of drum and bass and grime, and the spazzing drum beat feels like it's almost competing with Kano to see who could go faster. It feels like they're kind of sparring. Night Night is a track produced by Mike Skinner of The Streets, and for those of you that watch my 10 favourite albums video will know that I'm a big fan of what Mike Skinner does. And this is really clever because it bridges the gap between garage and grime, this track, and I like that because it's a kind of like a crossover, but it's not the crossover I'm talking about that perhaps waters down the grime sound. That is more the American styles being crossed over with the grime style. That's where you lose that British spirit, and not that there's anything wrong with that if you like the music, but what I'm saying is that it loses its grime authenticity in a way and really stops becoming grime when that happens, whereas this is a crossover from two different British styles, and actually grime came from the garage scene anyway, so it just adds a diversity to the sound on this album. This is a gorgeous emotive track that effectively utilises Skinner's ability to create, it's almost like an atmosphere of a reflective urban sprawl, and that really complements Kano's thoughtful lyrics about relationships and past mistakes. A great album and a brilliant example of the way grime can be built upon subtly without ever losing its core identity. Number 5, Skepta, Blacklisted, released in 2012. Yeah, it's technically another mixtape, but it's my video, so shut up. Skepta's pretty much become a household name by this point. He's had massive success with his 2016 record Konnichiwa, and he also won the Mercury Music Prize last year, much like Dizzee did back in '03. And also because of the crossover appeal of Boy Better Know, BBK, which is the group that Skepta and JME set up back in '06. JME's Skepta's brother, and also a grime artist as well. And bizarrely, they found themselves in bed with Drake these days, and now they've got this sort of love affair going on across the Atlantic. So there's a lot more. I mean, Skepta's brand and his appeal has become much more widespread since the release of that record. Personally, I found Konnichiwa a little uneven. I think specifically the tracks produced by Pharrell and 40 just strayed a little too far away from that grime sound. And for my money, there's no better way to sample Skepta's soul-searching spirit and unbridled talent than on the 2012 mixtape Blacklisted. Skepta did what a lot of the grime heavyweights ended up doing between 2007 and 2011, and that's aim for the charts and aim away from that core grime sound. It worked for some. I mean, look at Dizzee Rascal, and he's pretty much entirely taken on that persona now. He is more of a pop star than anything else, and it's something Wiley did for a while, although he has now gone back to that core grime sound with his new material. The arrival of Blacklisted was kind of like Skepta saying, actually, I don't want to do the chart thing, I don't want to be aiming for that, and this is the artistic vision I want to project, this is the sound that I want to make. Another completely different kind of grime record here. Blacklisted is serious and somber in its tone, but not in a way that's po-faced. The production here uses space within sound in a way that the other albums on this list don't really do, and what that does is that highlights the instrumentals. You have less on the palette, but it in a way it adds more. It's much less claustrophobic than the typical grime style that at this point have been perfected by producers and MCs. Quick point, the tracks aren't actually named if you stream the album, but it's not that difficult to find the track names if you're interested. First track, Same Shit Different Day, rhythmically relies on this deep bass drum. That's pretty much the only percussion that you get throughout the track, as all these different synth sounds hazily coalesce and flow, and it's a very ethereal sounding track, not something you'd probably expect to hear at the beginning of a grime record. That's a really interesting thing to hear, and nevertheless you still have Skepta's flow that sort of sits at the forefront. Second track, Castles, samples Riff Raff's Versace Python and somehow manages to not come across completely ridiculous, which to be honest is a feat in itself. You know, Skepta's vocal timbre adds a layer of introspection which completely changes the feeling of the song. If you listen to Riff Raff's original version and then this, you'll definitely see quite a stark contrast, and an interesting way that different artists will utilize an instrumental or production style to achieve a different feeling or a different atmosphere. Be an interesting thing. Go and listen to both and see what you think. Final track, 2 + 2 × 2, is like a celebratory, explosive ending to this record, and it brings out all the BBK members to all trade flows throughout. You've got people like KJ, Frisco, JME, Shorty, and Jammer. The production kind of has an East Coast hip-hop vibe to it, and see if you can hear that when you listen to it. That's certainly something that came across when I first listened to it, but it still feels like grime. There might be better grime records out there, but for my mind, this is a very satisfying grime release and very different to the other 4 records that I've talked about. That's why I wanted to talk about it. So I think you should check it out. Right, and that's it. That's my 5 albums to get you into grime, except 2 of them were mixtapes. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know what your favourite grime records are in the comment section below. Let me know what you think of my choices. Let's have a discussion about the genre, how it's represented. There's a lot of rich discussion to have around this genre, so let's have a chat about it in the comment section, and I'll see you soon.